So we want to welcome all of you to our webinar. Today's webinar is Redefining Beyond Loco, Redefining Mental Health in Latino Homes. So welcome, Jairo Suarez. Yeah.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We're glad to have you, Jairo. This is kind of a continuation from the last webinar that we did on multicultural counseling and multicultural phenomenon. So let me introduce Jairo. Jairo Suarez is a licensed professional counselor with experience counseling adolescents, adults, couples, and families. Jairo's experience as an immigrant has made him sensitive to the hardships faced by marginalized groups. He knows how it feels to be lost, confused, and isolated, and hopes to provide a safer place for his clients to experience connection. The Catholic faith has been a central part of Jairo's life. He attended Catholic schools for middle school, high school, college, and graduate school. Jairo is familiar with several Catholic traditions and subcultures, from the traditional Latin Mass to the charismatic movement. Outside of counseling, Jairo enjoys spending time with his loved ones, playing games, and doing theater both on and off stage. Thanks for joining us, Jairo.
Yep. Something I wanted to add too is, I'm a counselor here with Rejoice. I'm with the Itari group. Right now I serve clients both in person and virtually in the state of Texas. And specifically, I'm a bilingual counselor at St. Bartholomew the Apostle, St. Ignatius of Loyola, and then at the Itari Center.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for explaining where you work. That way, in case anybody's looking forward to following up with you afterwards, they can know where to find you.
Okay.
So this webinar is meant to follow up on the one we offered in February, right, regarding the multicultural experience of immigrant families. Would you mind sharing a little bit about yourself and your immigration journey?
Yeah. So my family immigrated to from Colombia, excuse me. We immigrated from Colombia in about 2000, tail end of 2000, beginning of 2001. So this is all information that I have learned from my parents. I was about a year and a half old, so I have no memories of this. Um, my family was very fortunate that made our immigration to the United States with my father's job, and so we were very lucky that my father's job sponsored the whole thing.
Yeah.
And so our transition to, receiving residency, like having a legal status when we came, and then transitioning to residency and then later on citizenship, we were very, very blessed and very, very fortunate in that. Um, since we landed in Houston, my parents needed to connect with people. They ended up connecting through the Catholic Church in the areas that we were living in, with the Hispanic communities there. So a lot of our ministry was, with the Hispanic community. Um, and, the reality is a lot of folks there are immigrants. Some of them have the blessing of being able to do it, um, where they have all their documentation in nice, neat shape. Others did not have that privilege. So we got an experience of just kind of getting to know kind of all walks of life when it comes to the immigrant experience.
Yeah, there's so many different ways that people immigrate, and so many reasons that people immigrate, probably as individual as the people themselves, right? And sometimes people are looking for a better life for their children. Sometimes it's because of work circumstances. And then sometimes people are forced to leave, and they don't really want to, but the injustice in their home country is so great that they have to get out, And what do you think are some of the aspects of your own process that are common to other immigrants that have come maybe in a different way?
Yeah. So I'd say some of the biggest ones, right, are just and I'll answer this one both in English and Spanish.
Oh yeah,
Like
different.
some of the aspects that are in common are, the biggest one being kind of like the language difference and the culture difference, right? My parents came here, like I didn't notice it as much, but I still noticed the difference of growing up in a household where, you know, I would speak to mom and dad in Spanish, even though at school I was speaking to everybody in English. And my parents were very, very like very careful to instill in us like, no, when you're at home, be respectful, speak to us in Spanish because that is, that's our language, it's like that's our family's language, that's where we will be able to best understand you and communicate with you. So my parents were very good about that. So there's that. And on the flip side, though, this also meant that with my parents, as they were still learning the language, they've, had 20 plus years to learn the language and get used to the culture. But a lot of times, my siblings and I, this is a really common experience for immigrant children, we would be like their interpreters and their translators. And this would be from anything from like parent teacher conferences to helping them fill out like bigger applications like bank applications, or when we had to go to the doctor, or when we were trying to buy a car, stuff like that, stuff that parents, kind of a role where a very common immigrant experience when there is that big language difference is that children get placed in this role where they have to learn more adult responsibilities than would be maybe expected for them at that age, and learn about subjects that they might not have the language for, that in a lot of cases for a lot of folks, even the parents themselves don't have the language for it, because it'll be like really technical, like medical or legal language. So that's one aspect. The other aspect that I would say is that I had, that is similar to what a lot of folks have, who other immigrants have, is growing up in a with a culture different from the one that you are currently living in, and how that can kind of blur the line for the identity when it comes to not feeling as Colombian as my family back home, but also not feeling as American as some of my classmates whose families have been here for longer. Um, so those would be some of the aspects. Um, Now, shifting that answer to Spanish. Entonces, tu pregunta era con respecto a qué son algunos aspectos de mi experiencia como inmigrante que son parecidos a los que yo he visto en otros inmigrantes que he conocido. Uno de los más grandes que a mí se me resalta es el aspecto de que, pues, la diferencia de lenguaje y de cultura. Que en el caso mío vinimos de un país donde hablábamos español a uno donde se habla primariamente inglés. Y entonces en mi hogar mis papás hicieron un buen trabajo de enseñarme a mí y mis hermanos de hablar en español con ellos. Íbamos a misa en español, entonces aprendimos todas nuestras oraciones en español, todo lo que era nuestra fe era en español, y generalmente todavía sigue siendo en español. Pero también nos inculcaron de que, ok, por respeto a ellos como nuestros padres, que les habláramos en español porque ese es el lenguaje que ellos más fácilmente se pueden comunicar. Por el otro lado, esa diferencia de lenguaje nos puso a mí y mis hermanos en una posición que muchos hijos de inmigrantes terminan, el que fuimos como sus traductores y sus intérpretes. Y eso podía ser algo tan simple como cuando íbamos a comer en un restaurante o cuando había una reunión en la escuela, pero también incluía cosas como cuando íbamos al médico o cuando mis papás estaban llenando papeleo legal, por ejemplo, para comprar un carro o hablando con el banco. Y eso puede ser algo que pone a los hijos inmigrantes en una posición donde tienen que aprender lenguaje y ideas y conceptos tal vez más adultos en una edad más pronto de lo que sería típico para esa edad. Sí, y también sí, y por el otro lado también esa parte de cultura donde, o sea, mis hermanos y yo crecíamos hasta dentro de nuestra propia generación. Mis hermanos menores son un poquito más americanos que mi hermana mayor y yo, que somos un poco más en el aspecto cultural, somos un poco más colombianos o más latinos, y mis hermanos tienen como una mentalidad más americana. Y el no sentirte completamente en como tu cultura original, pero tampoco completamente como la cultura en donde vives ahora.
Creo que el hecho de tener que traducir para tus papás también crea una dificultad en cuanto a al respeto, porque como primero están teniendo que traducir cosas que quizás no, vamos a decir que alguien en la familia tiene un diagnóstico de salud, eh,
Ujú,
de una enfermedad muy grave, el niño entera antes de que los papás, y después el niño tiene que estar explicando a la mamá o al papá qué está sucediendo, o en la
ujú,
escuela, cuando la maestra le está regañando al niño o diciendo que el niño no hizo algo bien, después el niño tiene que, los papás tienen que confiar que el niño está diciendo lo que hizo. Y
ujú,
creo que en las edades pequeñas no es tanta dificultad, pero cuando ya llegan a la adolescencia, creo que crea una dificultad mayor en algunos casos de que los jóvenes se sienten, yo tengo más autoridad que tú, porque yo entiendo esta cultura mejor que tú, que yo hablo el
ujú,
idioma mejor que tú. Y con
ujú,
ciertas personalidades de joven puede crear mucha dificultad entre las generaciones.
Ujú, ujú.
¿Piensas que eso sí pasa o qué pueden hacer? ¿Qué crees que pueden hacer cuando eso está sucediendo?
Sí, ese es una buena, muy buen punto. Una muy buena observación, Liz, que tienes razón, o sea, esa expectativa puede pasar. Y hay dos formas de hacerlo, ¿cierto? De que los jóvenes que se acuerden que, pues primero que todo, que ellos como adolescentes, o sea, como jóvenes, o sea, solo porque son adolescentes no significa que dejan de ser, o sea, que son completamente autosuficientes, así que también muchas veces es importante que los papás se acuerden que aunque los adolescentes están tomando un rol más responsable, ¿cierto? Y están tomando un cierto nivel de autoridad de traducir para sus papás, no quita que siguen siendo niños, o sea, no, sigue no quita que siguen en desarrollo. Así que en los casos como tú dices, todavía es importante que los papás actúen y digan y hablen con el nivel de cuidado y de guianza que se espera de un papá o de una mamá. Entonces, por un lado, hay esa parte del rol de los papás. Para los jóvenes, mi recomendación sería que ellos se acuerden que el, el saber más sobre un tema en particular no te hace necesariamente mejor que la otra persona. O sea, que por ejemplo, que ellos sepan cómo funciona mejor la cultura o el lenguaje o em, algún sistema aquí que existe en los Estados Unidos, no significa que los papás sean menos inteligentes, no significa que sean menos dignos de respeto, ¿cierto? It's like it's important to remember that, just because, ch- uh, young people in this position, might have more knowledge on their parents about how, you know, the culture and the language and certain systems here in the United States work compared to their parents, that doesn't make their parents like, it's important for young people to remember that just because they might know more about their parent, more than their parents about this one subject, does not mean their parents are less worthy of respect or that their parents are less intelligent. It just means they happen to know more about this specific subject. And then by the flip side, right, like I was saying earlier in Spanish, that it's also important on the parents' side to remember that, when their children are being put in this more kind of adult role, where they're taking on a little bit more authority, it is still important to remember that their children are still children who are developing, and they still need support and guidance, and to feel that, their parent's still the parent, and they will be the ones taking the lead on big family decisions, or, when there is a diagnosis or sickness, that doesn't, just because their child is interpreting or translating, does not mean that that responsibility now fully falls onto their child.
Yeah, I love your recommendations, Jairo. Focusing more on the mental health aspect of or where mental health could help immigrant families, what do you think are some of the difficulties that families face, either with communication or with relationships, or yeah, what would those be?
Yeah, yeah, that's great questions. One that I see a lot in the Hispanic families I work with is, communication in part because of like the expectation, right? Cultural expectations that, American culture tends to be a little bit more individualistic compared to a lot of Latin cultures, right? So there's expectations, that children and teens growing up here, they kind of do their own thing, fend for themselves, kind of not fend for themselves in the sense that the parents don't care for them, but fend for themselves in terms of not seeing their contributions as part of working within the family unit,
Hmm.
right? Whereas in a lot of Hispanic cultures, it is just more understood that when children are contributing, they're contributing because they're part of the family unit, right?
Hmm.
Like that's part of being a family. And so a lot of parents and grandparents and uncles and aunts, a lot of like elders have that expectation, and kids and teens don't really understand that. So that's like one aspect I see with the communication. Another one too is just communication insofar as like there's the cultural difference, but then there's also like the kind of like age demographic difference, like the generational difference,
Hmm.
right? That when we're talking about mental health, um, a lot of the generation of like parents now are kind of that first generation where mental health started to be accepted as something that people get for themselves, right?
Hmm.
And even here and in a lot of Latin American countries, uh, there is still like a bit of stigma around it, and I'm sure like we'll talk more about what that stigma is and how to combat that stigma. But when it comes to mental health, right, it's like families can struggle in accepting like that, that mental health is even a real concern, right? So like the youth, right, the children and the teens might be really aware of that,
Hmm.
and the young adults might be really aware of that. Their parents might be aware of, okay, they need help, they have a problem, but maybe there's hesitancy around treating it as mental health. Maybe they go to a doctor, maybe they go to their priest and try to take care of it as if it were a medical problem or a spiritual problem. And there are obviously like medical and spiritual aspects to people's mental health. Um, but that's different than treating a mental health issue as purely a medical issue or purely a spiritual issue. So parents are kind of in that, like I've noticed that like the generation of like parents are kind of like in that limbo, and then grandparents, God bless them. I've had some, like I have seen like they can be really really vulnerable, and at least by the time they come to the counseling room, um, but they're having to unlearn like a lot of just like the way they were raised and the time they grew up in. That
Hmm.
mental health was not something that was talked about, just period. That was not a concern that people had in the generation of our grandparents and our great grandparents.
Hmm.
So I've noticed there's a lot of humility coming from, especially like grandparents and parents who come to counseling, that there's a degree to where they're like, hey, I don't know about this. I know there's a problem. I don't have the language for it. I don't have the words for it. So yeah, those are some of the communication aspects of communication I've noticed as far as working with Hispanic families.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't think that it's only the Latino culture that has shame around
Hmm.
going to counseling. I mean, I know even um, other people, other cultures, right, who would also have a lot of shame or have to overcome shame,
Yeah,
and yeah,
yeah.
actually, maybe
I agree with
that's
you. Like, yeah,
maybe that's a good
yeah.
question to follow with. Like, what do you think the stigma comes from? It's kind of why we titled the Beyond Local, right? Like, why
Right,
we titled it the way we titled it. So.
right, right, right. Right. I think part of it has to do like where the stigma comes from. Part of it is just a historical reality. The field of psychology is, if we're being like as the formal science it exists as now goes back to about the 1800s.
Mhm.
If we're talking about, kind of origins of the systematized style of science that exists now. Psychology has existed as long as there's been people, right? We've been studying how the mind works and how the soul works for as long as as long as human beings have been conscious. But to treat it as a specific focus of mental and like mental processes, mental illness, mental health, right? That's still relatively new in the history of the world. So I think part of it is that in a lot of these cultures like that, the change has been gradual, and historically in most of the world, those issues would have been seen as spiritual. Somebody would have been like, right, like a person with a mental illness would have been seen as, for lack of a better word, loco, crazy, sick,
Mhm.
different, um, because that was the explanation for it. So there's that aspect. The other aspect is that in a lot of cultures that are, I mean, just a lot of cultures, right? It kind of transcends culture to a degree where there is a degree of vulnerability that comes from admitting that there is a problem. And I think it's a very natural human instinct to want to contain that problem and say like, okay, no, this isn't happening, or like you keep it within the family.
Mhm.
And so like when people grow up in an environment where they're seeing an issue as no, 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 we don't talk about this because if we don't talk about it, it doesn't exist. And then you then apply that to an individual level. It's okay. I'm not going to talk about this. If I don't talk about this, it doesn't exist.
Mhm.
So I think that's where a lot of the shame comes from, is that there is a degree of like people don't want to either A, they're afraid of admitting that there is a problem. Um, that's one reason I've seen. Another one is people are afraid that, like clients have told me about, is like fear of being judged or being rejected by people, by their communities or their loved ones or their families if they are you know presenting with an issue. Um, a third one would be fear around having like fear around being vulnerable, like fear of admitting that there is like weakness and not wanting to be seen as weak. And I think that's something you especially see in men, right? Like that's a big issue as to why, men cross culturally don't seek mental health, but you see it especially in, a lot of our immigrant populations that they are coming from these cultures where there's a really big pressure in a lot of these cultures to that men be strong, but to be strong in a very specific kind of external way.
Mhm.
Yeah, so those are some of my reasons why I think shame is such a big part of the equation.
Yeah, it came to my mind the idea of keeping it within the family, right? There's don't put shame on our family. You don't let things be known outside of the family sometimes. And there's a phrase in AA that you're only as sick as your secrets. I don't know how to translate
Mm,
that to Spanish. Do you not? Would you? How would you
mm.
translate that? You're only as sick
Um,
as your secrets.
que solo estás tan enfermo como tus secretos están enfermos.
Uh-huh.
That would be how that's like what just comes to mind. I'm sure there's maybe a different way to phrase it or a
Yeah,
better way to phrase it.
maybe somebody dressed it up and made it rhyme or something. But yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Well, so I'm noticing the time, and we had way too many questions planned for this. We should have just stuck with a few, but we'll move into now questions. So addressing questions that have been put in the chat and questions that have been sent to
yeah,
us. So following up with this discussion of stigma, Father placed in the chat that he was seeing a Hispanic couple, and the wife mentioned a few times that it was a very big deal for the husband to be going to counseling because of their culture. And his question is if there's anything that a counselor can do to help mitigate the stigma for a couple that's Latino, and
yeah.
he's himself not Latino. So.
Right, right, right. So a big one is like asking them, if the couple has made you aware that one or both of them is worried about the stigma, right? Is just, addressing it as a question, just asking them like, hey, you mentioned you felt uncomfortable or like you felt like some kind of hesitancy to even come to counseling. Would you mind sharing like what that hesitancy is? Just to get an idea of like what specific stigma they're worried about. And then on the flip side, right, if they're coming, that's fantastic. Ask them what it is that, that keeps them coming so that you can, maybe facilitate that as either a counselor or in ministry, you know, if they're there and they keep coming back, there must be something that's working for them or something that is helping them feel more comfortable. So just, opening up the conversation more than anything, open-ended questions are going to be, um, you're one of your best friends here when it comes to helping to kind of to talk about stigma and then destigmatize the experience. Um, yeah, just open-ended questions.
Awesome. Melanie says, do you find it common in Latino culture? Sorry, my chat just moved. That families would rather not report abuse or acknowledge that abuse is happening for the sake of keeping the peace or maintaining an image of the family. This was my personal experience, and I wanted to know if this is just my experience.
Yes. So first of all, Melanie, thank you for the vulnerability in sharing that. I'm really sorry that that's the experience you've had. Um, unfortunately, it's not exclusive to your experience. It is an experience I've seen a lot happen in a lot of different cultures, in the Latino culture especially, but in also other cultures, kind of like Liz said, there is a lot of like shame around talking about abuse and about problems that a family's having. Um, Part of it can be around expectations regarding gender or age and respect and authority. That it is oftentimes the case that abusers are going to be people in positions of authority, whether that be familial authority or social authority. And in Hispanic culture specifically, since that's what we're talking about, there is like a deference to authority that oftentimes leads families to, either stay silent to defend the person who's in the position of authority because that's the expectation of obedience, or out of fear of speaking out against them. Um, yeah, so that's kind of some of the observations I've had, both, from my studies, but also like working with families that have experienced some kind of abuse that happens. And also just like the element of not being, like a lack of education, right? It often is the case that I've worked with families where part of my job ends up being educating families about what abuse is and isn't. And a lot of times family members will, when they're open to it, you know, be surprised that a certain behavior that they had was abusive. Maybe they identify it as hurtful or mean, but it can still be helpful for a counselor. Like, it's so incredibly helpful for a counselor to point out, no, no, this kind of behavior is abusive, and for them as a family to realize, oh, okay, like this can't continue.
Yeah, Jairo. I just think it's very complex. The family dynamics that keep those secrets hidden, and it's not uncommon. You
Mm-hmm.
know, it's not uncommon that the mom doesn't or the wife doesn't speak out or doesn't stop it. It's not uncommon. It's very common that the person who's abusing, especially sexual abuse, be a family member,
Mm-hmm.
even an extended family member or a direct family member. It's yeah, just terrible. Okay, another question. Some people will say there's a connection with being diagnosed with a mental illness and being dumb or slow. So they really don't want to be diagnosed with a mental illness. Or some parents don't want their child to be seen this way. So maybe what might be helpful with overcoming that thought, like to be dumb or
Yeah,
stupid if you
yeah,
have mental illness.
yeah. I think it's a great observation and also like a great question, and because a big part of our role too as counselors is to be educators, and this question also ties into what I was mentioning with the history, right? Historically, a lot of people who have like in like just parlance were called, dumb or slow or different or weird, right? Now that we have more tools and more research about, learning differences, um, learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, neurodivergence, right? We know that that's not, maybe some folks need more support, right? If there is a legitimate delay or disability, people need support.
Mm-hmm.
If they just have a difference, then it's accommodating for that difference. And I think people understandably are afraid of their children or themselves even being treated differently. Because a conversation I often see with families in this is that, we start talking about the children having some kind of difference, whether that be a disability, whether that be, um, neurodivergence, whether that be, which for the record also neurodivergence refers to conditions like autism, ADHD. Just because I realize like that I'm using a term that maybe the audience doesn't
Yeah.
might not be familiar with what neurodivergence is, but neurodivergence being, the conditions that the brain has that, make somebody's brain operate a little bit differently than somebody who does not have that condition. Um, and so because there's this stigma, families understandably don't want their child to be treated differently, or they don't want to be treated differently. And so when I've been working with families around, a child presenting with an issue like this, the conversation understandably will turn to, oh, has anybody else in the family ever exhibited similar traits? And I notice like a parent, like families, like older adults, be it parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, in Latino families, will kind of bristle. They'll get uncomfortable at the thought that maybe they have that too.
Yeah.
Because it is often the case that, these are traits that are kind of to a degree genetic, and so there are usually similarities within family systems. Um, yes. And then speaking of, right, since we're talking about attention deficit disorder, I see we have a question. This one's in Spanish that says, ¿Cómo explicar que tener déficit de atención no es estar loco? Um, pues uno es explicar, ok, pues entender muy bien qué es la déficit de atención. Y la déficit de atención, como estaba hablando en inglés, es una diferencia en cómo el cerebro funciona. O sea, de la misma forma que cada persona tiene una diferente personalidad, la función de cada cerebro va a ser un poquito diferente. Y entonces, la déficit de atención se refiere específicamente a una persona que tiene cierto patrón de que su cerebro funciona de cierta forma. Y muchas veces cuando estamos hablando de algo como déficit de atención, los problemas vienen siendo por, uno, falta de apoyo, ¿cierto? O sea, falta de apoyo educativo o laboral, o del alimenticio, porque son cosas que son muy importantes para manejar algo como déficit de atención. Y dos, que a veces lo que hace una persona que no esté bien, a veces no es tanto la condición que ellos tienen, sino el ambiente en que ellos están. Porque sea, por ejemplo, algo como déficit de atención, la razón que muchas personas sufren cuando están en la escuela es porque la escuela, como está organizada ahorita, o muchas escuelas debería decir, como están organizadas, no son ambientes en donde alguien que tiene déficit de atención va a poder funcionar fácilmente. O sea, es un ambiente en sí donde estás sentado 7, 8 horas al día por una hora consecutiva, donde te metes en problemas si te distraes o si hablas o si te mueves mucho. Entonces, no es tanto, es importante con déficit de atención, pero otras condiciones también de salud mental, que a veces es enseñarle a los demás que a veces es el contexto que hace que algo sea un problema y no la condición en sí.
Sí, por ejemplo, en el pasado, hace años, cuando trabajábamos laboralmente, muchas personas trabajaban, o hasta los niños tenían en el verano, hacían labores en el campo o llegaban a su casa y hacían labor física. Entonces tenían unos 5 horas en la escuela durante el tiempo
Ujú,
de la escuela, la temporada de la escuela, y el resto del tiempo estaban haciendo labores con su cuerpo, moviéndose. Entonces,
ujú,
si eran hiperactivos, tenían el movimiento que necesitaban. O si tenían la presentación de inhabilidad de enfocarse, uh, se podían solo tener que enfocarse durante la periodo de escuela. Entonces, sí,
ujú,
sí, a veces es encontrar una escuela que va a funcionar para tu hijo
ujú,
también, o tu adulto, quien sea, un trabajo que va a funcionar para el adulto que tiene
ujú,
ADHD. Sí,
ujú,
sí. Am, Asociado con esa pregunta, porque muchas veces sugieren medicamento para personas con ADHD y otros condiciones de salud mental.
ujú,
Am, Acerca de tomar medicamento, veo que muchas personas tienen reserves, no
ujú,
quieren o tienen
ujú.
preocupaciones. ¿Podrías hablar a ese tema?
Sí, sí. Entonces, primero que todo, quiero decir que muchas de esas preocupaciones son válidas. Como he dicho, el campo de la psicología y de psiquiatría, que es la parte de medicina de salud mental, todavía es cierto, es un campo que se está desarrollando y todavía es relativamente joven. Entonces, hay ciertos aspectos del cerebro que no entendemos por 100%. Por eso es que algunos medicamentos funcionan, pero tal vez no funcionan completamente para ciertas condiciones. Una que se me viene a la mente, por ejemplo, es la depresión, ¿cierto? Hay muchos diferentes tipos de medicamento que tal vez darían para algo como depresión y no todas van a tener el mismo efecto. Entonces, primero que todo es entender que algunas de esas preocupaciones son válidas. Am, por el otro lado, es importante también reconocer que, ok, si, si estás con una condición que podría manejarse con medicamento, es importante conectarte con un psiquiatra que, que se comunique muy bien, porque eso es la parte clave, que de trabajar clínicamente para condiciones de salud mental es en dos fases, ¿cierto? Lo puedes ver de la forma como una condición crónica, como algo como la diabetes o la hipertensión, que tu médico te la prescribe, dice, ok, tienes diabetes, tienes que monitorear tu azúcar y tienes que tomarte ese medicamento. Y en adición a eso, vas a tener que hacer ciertos cambios a tu estilo de vida, a tu alimentación, em, tu horario de dormir, cuánto agua tomas, ¿cierto? Entonces, cuando se trata de la salud física, muchas veces ya como que entendemos que hay la parte del medicamento y la parte de los cambios de vida día a día. Y eso es el tratamiento completo. Cuando se trata del medicamento en el sentido de la salud mental, es muy parecido. Las condiciones de salud mental, los que son trastornos, muchos de esos son como condiciones crónicas. Entonces, por ejemplo, el tomar medicamento para una condición como la depresión o como para la ansiedad, la idea de la medicina es que la medicina no cura el problema que estás teniendo. Simplemente te permite hacer las otras cosas, como ir a consejería o ir a la iglesia, vivir una vida sana. Entonces es parecido al el medicamento que tomarías para algo como tu presión, es un apoyo, no es la solución sí en sí.
Wow, you answered that really well, Jairo. That's a great
Thank you.
explanation. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
if
Because I think it's fair that people have concerns around medication. And like I was saying in Spanish, that it's important to view a lot of mental health conditions as like treat them the way you would like a chronic condition, like something like diabetes, where you have the medication usually. Your doctor will give you the medication to help monitor the blood sugar, but you also have to make lifestyle changes. And so in the case of mental health, it would be you take the medication so that you can do, your counseling, your therapy, your AA, your support group, your healthy relationships.
Yeah, the gold standard really in mental health care is medication with therapy. And the medication gets you to a place where you're able to do the work of therapy, right? Because therapy is work, right? Yeah, absolutely. And not everybody needs medication, but something I hear
Mhm,
often is fear of getting addicted to medication. And I don't know, the knowledge that I have is that not many of only the anxiety medications, the anxiolytics. Not that I'm a
mhm,
psychiatrist. I'm not a psychiatrist at all, right? But those are the ones that tend to have more dependency characteristics, and so those are really regulated. But the other medications that one might take for ADHD or for depression don't tend to be addictive per se. Like you're obviously you would feel side effects if you get off it or you just drop it cold turkey, but it's not the exact same thing as really being addicted to something. So,
mhm.
yeah. What about the situation where maybe I'm a younger person, I'm a young adult, and I see that my parents actually could benefit from counseling? Um, is there anything I can do there? What could I do?
Yeah, yeah. So like approach the situation with patience, right? Um, Kind of temper the expectations, right? You want to help your parents, and you want to help you want to help the relationship you have with them, because that's ultimately what it's for. It's you want your parents to get help so that your relationship to them can be healthier, so that you're not in as much distress or as upset as often because of their behavior. And it can be helpful to present it as you want to have a better relationship with them, you want them to be healthier, and a counselor can be somebody who can help them to make the tweaks that they need to make so that they can be healthier, while also tempering the expectation that, if you're a young adult, your parents might not change. Like, that's the reality of it. There's another person. Like, you can't control that whether or not other people choose to change. And even if they do therapy, they might not make the changes you're hoping they make.
That's
Because
so
therapy is dependent, because therapy is ultimately dependent on what you as, like, what the client tells the counselor, as I'm sure you know, Liz, right? We're going off of the fact that we're I don't want to say limited, but we are operating off of what our clients tell us, like what you as the client coming to counseling tell us. And so, sometimes it is the case that people don't really improve in therapy because they don't tell their therapist the whole truth, or because they don't do the work outside of session. And so I would say just be patient, also temper the expectation, and make be willing to set boundaries if those changes don't happen, because that is a possibility as well.
that's so true. You made me laugh because I was thinking, very few people or some people will come in and say like, "Oh, my daughter told me I need to come here and she said I need to say XYZ." And then as a counselor, you're just like, "Oh, okay. And what do you think about that?" So it's yeah. Yeah, we can only do so much and however, I think the question I didn't read this part of it, but they were mentioning like how do we set boundaries in that case? So say the parent doesn't
Yeah.
want to go. Like
Right. And because I think I know which question you're talking about. And so boundaries, first of all, I think it's important to be really clear on what boundaries are. Boundaries are specifically related to what you are willing to do or not do based on, how you're feeling, what other people are doing. And so it's important to say, like, boundaries are not going to be something where you say as a person, I'm going to make the other person do X, Y, or Z. Boundaries are, okay, here's my plan if my mom starts to yell at me. Or here's my plan, here's what I'm going to do if my dad starts to blame me for something I didn't do. And boundaries can look like, spending some time apart, but it can be like putting distance between you and the other person. But it can also be, ways that you would tweak interactions with the other person so that you still have a relationship with them. It could be things like, um, you know, choosing to, only do phone calls or choosing to do only in person, choosing to meet with them in public settings versus private settings, choosing to meet with the family member or interact with a family member for a specific amount of time. Boundaries are basically little things that you can do individually to feel that you have control over the situation and you have control over your actions in the situation. So those would be some examples of boundaries that maybe we don't think about as boundaries. Um, and some boundaries are important to communicate clearly, but other boundaries you don't need to say them. For example, if you're only going to talk to your mom, if you choose to only speak with a difficult family member over the phone, that's not really a boundary that you need to communicate. It's just something that you yourself know that you're going to do.
You just start doing it. You don't have to tell them,
You
I'm
just
only
you
going to
start
call
doing it. You don't
you.
have to announce
Right.
it, right? You don't have to announce it.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well,
Yeah.
Jairo, we've come to the end of our time for today, but would you like to leave us with any words of wisdom, or if there was one thing you'd like our participants to walk away with, what would that be?
Oh, oof, you put me in a really important one. Um, be curious, stay curious, both with encourage curiosity in your loved ones' lives and your communities, because curiosity helps to undo a lot of the shame, because a lot of the shame is based on fear of the unknown or of things we don't understand. Having the curiosity to learn about yourself, about other people, about mental health issues can help to undo some of that stigma, some of that shame. So please stay curious. Um, Para dar ese mensaje en español, lo que yo a mí me gustaría dejarles a ustedes es que manténganse curiosos porque la curiosidad ayuda a deshacer un poco de ese miedo del no entender, de lo desconocido, de lo que no entendemos, y con esa curiosidad tal vez se abren más a buscar la ayuda si la necesitan.
Muchas gracias, Jairo. Mil gracias. Gracias por tu tiempo, por compartir tu experiencia con nosotros. Thank you all for joining us. We thank Jairo for his time and his experience and his wisdom. And we look forward to joining you guys in the next one.